Hello and welcome to week 2 of PA117. I am teaching chapter 2. I think it's very interesting that they have just come up with laws since the 1900s, which, thinking back just hundreds of years ago. So, and drugs have been around for a very long time. So it really goes back to what we were saying last week about how something has to be abused, and then a law is in place for drugs to have a law. So I wanted to go over and discuss some of these subjects that they talk about. So the two areas of the government that controls drugs are the FDCA, which is the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, FDCA, and then also the CSA, which is the Controlled Substance Act. And so those are very good for you to know, put that to memory of who actually does the governing of those laws. And it says the CSA usually just deals with the addictive potential of drugs to be abused, so really all of the controlled substances. So if they have that C beside them and then they have a number, that's a controlled substance, and it ranks of how much they can be abused to the potential of not being abused. So that's the CSA for you. So then it goes into this chapter, really goes into the different laws of what came about and what first came about. The first one was actually in 1906. It was by Dr. Harvey Wiley, a physician and a congressman, persuaded Congress to pass the Federal Food and Drug Act of 1906, commonly called the Wiley Act of 1906. The act banned adulterated and misbranded food, drink, and drugs from interstate commerce. Although with the passing of this act, the need for regulation was finally recognized, and this law was ultimately considered inadequate for a number of regions. So untrue statements made by the manufacturer were not considered misbranding by the courts. This act included legislation regarding only food, drink, and drugs, but not cosmetics. So like if you had a makeup or a lotion and they could say, this will heal this, technically, if it didn't, it doesn't matter, because they were not governed under the Wiley Act. And although this act limited commerce to those drugs that were safe, it did not authorize the banning of unsafe drugs. And finally, the medication's contents were still not required to be identified on the label. So it said, when you're marketing this drug, you can't say this, but it didn't give unsafe drugs the reason not to make anymore. So Congress corrected the false statement situation by including a definition of misbranding and encompassed false or fraudulent claims, but other problems were not addressed. Of course, this left consumers almost as unprotected as before, so the Wiley Act of 1906 did not accomplish much other than being the first time it was recognized that drugs and other consumables needed regulation to protect the public. So although it is not in existence anymore, it was a first step to saying, oh yes, something needs to be happening with this government to put some drugs into effect. So then the opium epidemic of the early 1900s came into effect, and narcotic drugs possessed a high potential for abuse. And so people who smoked opium and its chemical derivatives were commonplace in metropolitan areas worldwide. So President Teddy Roosevelt referred to opium as the greatest threat to the safety of the United States at that time. In an attempt to control this, the International Opium Convention of 1912 was held at The Hague in the Netherlands, and numerous nations came together hoping in controlling narcotics through international agreements and treaties. Each nation signed, and they only person specially licensed could import or export opium. So we're talking about like doctors or pharmacists. The use of these drugs were then limited to legislation and medical use only. And finally, the import and export of these narcotic drugs were to be supervised by each government. So they put into effect the Federal Narcotic Act of 1914, also called the Harrison Narcotic Act of 1914, after its primary sponsor. So these, remember I was talking to you first week, knowing the laws, this comes up on a lot of the different tests, and you will be quizzed over some of these, but it might be a good idea to really just start some flashcards to get what they're called, what they were for, what the dates were. These are all questions that they might ask in the certification test, and also in your quizzes and your midterm exams. So I wanted to mention those. And so then you can read some of the other topics in this chapter. So again, a very short chapter, but I wanted to talk about the habit-forming and dangerous drugs. Society became more alert to the dangers of some drugs through a conscious base, not as specific instances, such as mentioned in this chapter, but an awareness that developed gradually. Street use of heroin and other chemicals, the emergence of gangs in urban centers and their trafficking of these items, and the dangers to individuals in society that were present in these conditions led lawmakers to move to control these dangerous substances. So in 1970, the Federal Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act, usually called the Controlled Substance Act, or CSA, was passed. This legislation, which created methods of controlling drugs that were deemed dangerous through their potential for abuse and addiction. And this is more discussed in Chapter 4. You do need to know what CSA was and what they controlled for these, for your assignment and your quiz, but then it goes into more discussion in Chapter 4. So, and again, 7 questions. I would go ahead and try to answer all of them. I know that not all of them are due for your assignment, but I think it's just really good practice. All right, that concludes my lecture for this week. I hope you're having a good time in this class learning about the different laws and why we have them in place. And if you're having any questions, please email me, and I would love to answer. Talk with you soon. Bye-bye.